Former Senator Rick Santorum and Congressman Ron Paul have three things in common. Number one, they are both running in the Republican presidential primary. Number two, they both gave Mitt Romney a huge run for his money in the Iowa caucuses last night. And three, because of the fact that they are both Republicans, Mr. Santorum and Dr. Paul also both believe that government should be large enough and intrusive enough to make sure that every fertilized egg in this country results in the live birth of a baby. In today's Republican Party and in Republican presidential politics especially, being anti-abortion is orthodoxy. It is a given. For Ron Paul, being anti-abortion is the one real exception to his small government ideological purism. Being against abortion is the one and only thing that these two Mitt Romney alternatives agree on. But on every other policy issue of substance, Rick Santorum and Ron Paul are total opposites. They are oil and water, black and white, carbohydrate and fat. Rick Santorum believes that it is the proper role of government to determine the purpose for and meaning of every American's sex life, for example.
We'll repeal Obamacare and get rid of any kind of idea that you have to have abortion coverage or contraceptive coverage. And one of the things I will talk about that no president has talked about before is I think the dangers of contraception. It's not okay because it's a license to do things in the sexual realm that is counter to how things are supposed to be. They're supposed to be within marriage. They're supposed to be for purposes that are, yes, conjugal, but also immunitive, but also procreative. And that's the perfect way that a sexual union should happen.
Rick Santorum would like to use the government to dictate the perfect sexual union for all families in America because he knows what it is. Contrast that with Ron Paul, who would happily legalize prostitution and, even heroin, too.
Senator, are you suggesting that heroin and prostitution are an exercise of liberty?
Well, I probably never used those words. You put those words someplace, but yes.
On foreign policy, Rick Santorum is an unapologetic, fire-breathing neoconservative, an interventionist and military expansionist. He believes we should use our military to solve every problem east of the Atlantic and west of the Pacific. Every bad guy who doesn't like America should be met with the full force of our military if you're Rick Santorum.
I think we want to have an activist America to keep our country safe by being a leader in the free world, and that means to go after the enemy who has attacked us.
The activist America that Rick Santorum wants is one that would still be at war in Iraq, would not have honored the agreement brokered by President George W. Bush to leave Iraq by the end of last year. The mistake made in terms of that war was not starting the Iraq war in the first place, but in Rick Santorum's mind, the only mistake there was ending the war too soon.
We have a president who is not able to set conditions and actually have the kind of influence over the Iraqi government. Now 3 years the president has had to work with the Iraqi government to try to mold and shape that relationship. The weakness of this president in being able to shape the battlefield, if you will. And I think that's the reason people are so upset that, we've lost, in many respects, we've lost control and lost the war in Iraq.
Rick Santorum wishes we were still there in Iraq. Not being there is a sign of weakness. Ron Paul never thought we should have been fighting in Iraq in the first place.
I talk a lot about the wars going on overseas. I did my best to try to stop them. I remember the first speech I gave on the House floor about trying to stop something in Iraq. It didn't happen in 2001 or 2000. It happened in 1998. That's when they passed a bill that said it is now our policy to have regime change in Iraq, as it's going to lead to war.
On the other war, on Afghanistan, Rick Santorum is a big supporter. Ron Paul, he thinks that's illegal.
This war is an illegal war. This war is an immoral war. This war is an unconstitutional war. And the least you could say it's illegitimate. There's no real purpose in this. The Taliban did not attack us on 9/11. After we went into Afghanistan, immediately the concerns were shifted to remaking the Middle East.
So Rick Santorum, huge fan of both of our wars this decade. Ron Paul, totally and completely against both of them. And what about our maybe future wars, like in Iran, possibly? Rick Santorum would, forgive the term, like to bomb the bejesus out of them as soon as possible.
I would be working openly with the state of Israel, and I would be saying to the Iranians, you either open up those facilities, you begin to dismantle them and make them available to inspectors, or we will degrade those facilities through airstrikes and make it very public that we are doing that.
Now, Ron Paul, on the other hand, could not be more the opposite. Ron Paul is not just against going to war with Iran, he's even against sanctioning that nuclear ambitious country.
Countries that you put sanctions on, you are more likely to fight them. I say a policy of peace is free trade, stay out of their internal business, don't get involved in these wars, and just bring our troops home.
On corruption and ethics issues, we got the same kind of divide. Rick Santorum is a former lobbyist. Quote, Pennsylvania, which became one of the first states to deregulate pro wrestling after an aggressive lobbying effort, begun in 1987 under the guidance of a young associate at the law firm of Kirkpatrick and Lockhart named Rick Santorum, pro wrestling lobbyist. Ron Paul, however, has never been a lobbyist, and I have no idea how he feels about pro wrestling. Ron Paul's financial portfolio shows he's invested most of his money where you would invest it if you were the guy with the darkest forecast for the American economy and you're always warning about inflation. He's invested in gold mining. Ron Paul's money lives where his mouth is. And if you compare their voting records from Rick Santorum's last couple years in the Senate, Rick Santorum voted for the defense appropriations bill. Ron Paul did not. Santorum voted for the Central American Free Trade Agreement. Ron Paul did not. Rick Santorum voted to renew the Patriot Act and is very proud of it. Ron Paul did not and is very proud of it. So to the extent that Mitt Romney has to contend with a Republican electorate that doesn't like him all that much, that can't seem to coalesce around him, what Mitt Romney specifically has to contend with is a Republican electorate that doesn't seem to like him very much. And the part of the Republican electorate that doesn't like him very much is totally bifurcated and totally split between two, not just different, but completely opposite positions. If you take Ron Paul seriously and his followers seriously, and I do, and if you take Rick Santorum seriously and his supporters seriously, and I newly do, the idea that Republican voters will eventually coalesce around a non-Romney candidate that is powerful enough to unseat Mitt Romney is hard to see. The Santorum people and the Paul people are not going to find common ground, except on banning abortion. That's it. It's only if you, frankly, ignore Ron Paul and you ignore his issues and you pretend all the other candidates are kind of like Santorum and Gingrich and Perry and Bachmann and all the rest of them. It's only if you ignore what Ron Paul stands for that you can see a non-Romney consensus candidate emerging. You have to wish the Ron Paul thing away in order to believe that. Joining us now is Michael Steele, MSNBC contributor and the former chairman of the Republican Party. It's great to see you.
It's good to be back. Happy New Year.
Thank you.
I see you're a firebrand as ever. Well, I take exception to a few of the things you were saying.
Tell me what you take exception.
Well, I think just on 2 points, just very broadly. Number one, with respect to the abortion question in particular, both Ron Paul and Rick Santorum, their objection, where they agree, is at the federal level. Government, they don't want to grow government to get involved in that. They actually would like to move it back to the states and have the states decide these issues on a state-by-state basis, which is more consistent with what Republicans have argued. Let's get the federal government out of this realm of, that's one of the objections with Roe versus Wade, is that it federalized the issue as opposed to keeping it at the state level.
But by preventing the states from doing it, you prevented the state from being involved in monitoring every fertilized egg in the country to force it. That's a federal intervention, and there are those in the party who object to that. Just to put that there. But you get my point, though, that a big intrusive state government is still a big intrusive government.
Exactly, but that big intrusive state government answers more directly to the people who elect those officials and have a way of saying and putting on the table what they want versus what they don't want, much more than you do at the federal level. Because
the federal level protects rights, right?
Well,
at the federal level, the Constitution.
So do states. But remember, you can't negate the 10th Amendment. And so you cannot take away from the states the ability to regulate and make decisions that are closest to the people, because that's what the people want or don't want.
Should the states have the right to make a decision about what types of people are served in private businesses?
Well, now you're talking about mixing the private sector and the federal and the state and the government sector.
But let's say, if a state wants to, if a private business wants to say, you know what, we don't serve a specific kind of people here, we're going to make that decision.
If it's like a private country club?
Yeah,
sure they can.
So the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a bad idea?
No. So now you've leapt to something that's inconsistent. It's not saying that that's a bad idea because this group of people who have this private club over here don't want to do that. Doesn't make that a bad idea. It just says more about these people over here than it does about the good idea of the Civil Rights Act.
But this is the basic idea, right? That the federal Constitution stops states from doing things that
and how does the federal government regulate that?
Basic human rights.
If this private club wants federal money to fix the public street in front of its business, then guess what? The federal government says you're going to have to adhere to all of those little things like the Civil Rights Act.
But do you think that the Civil Rights Act should be tied specifically to highway money, and that there's no way that a constitutional ruling by the Supreme Court should be applied to block somebody from doing something that a state wants to allow?
But that's crazy. I agree, but that's what we've gotten to, where they do take federal money and they use it as the incentive or the disincentive to engage in constitutional behavior. So that's
the the U.S. Constitution being used to protect rights that states don't want to protect is an argument that I would love to have if we're going to do that. But I got to ask you about Rick Santorum versus Ron Paul here. Yeah. Don't you think they're sort of opposites? I mean, aside from abortion, they sort of represent opposites in policy.
Oh, they do represent opposites. But the second point that I was going to disagree with you slightly on is that I would not see that there's this level of equality in saying that, this segment of the GOP is now split in half, and half of it is, Ron Paul and half of it is represented by Rick Santorum. I think that you find that that libertarian portion of the GOP is smaller than a lot of people think it is.
Not that much smaller in Iowa.
But Iowa,
25-21.
But Iowa's but keep in mind the Iowa vote wasn't just Republicans voting. Okay, so
those weren't Republicans voting for Ron Paul?
You had independents who had signed up to vote in the Republican primary. I mean, that was part of that process. And you'll see the same thing in New Hampshire. So you cannot take these primaries, particularly when they're open primaries, and say that that's a reflection necessarily of...
So your reaction to this thesis is that you really should not count the Ron Paul people. They're not real Republicans.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all.
But you're saying that's only a tiny sliver of the Republican election?
I'm not saying it's a tiny sliver. I'm saying you're trying to say that there's a one-for-one equality, that, that the party is so split in half that you got half the folks on this side of the room, half the folks on this side of the room. I'm saying it's not that way. There are points of disagreement, without a doubt. But as you pointed out, there are also areas where they do agree. And when you talk about small government, you talk about economic issues, you talk about those types of things.
No, they're totally different. On economic issues and the size of government, other than on abortion, Rick Santorum and Ron Paul are diametrically opposed.
Well, you're talking
he's like Mr. Earmark, and Mr. Earmarks are...
You're talking Rick Santorum's position and Ron Paul's position. And what I'm talking about, the people behind them who represent those various factions within the party as conservatives, small government conservatives, who are economic conservatives, who are fiscal conservatives. They kind of intermix there. It's not this sort of wall of division the way you painted it.
Well,
would like to paint it.
I love that is the way you see it, because if you're thinking about that represents mainstream Republican thinking on that, that means nobody's taking Ron Paul seriously, and that means that those votes are still out there.
No one's taking Ron Paul seriously.
Absolutely confusing the process.
Ron Paul is taken very seriously, and I think that right now, if these candidates are smart, they would be making whatever appeals that they can to the Ron Paul supporters out there, particularly because they're young, energetic individuals who have engaged in the political process. So don't take what I'm saying as, not taking Ron Paul seriously. What I'm saying is there's not this, this big wall of divide as you would like to paint. What I'm saying is that there are points of disagreement, and individual candidates may have specific issues where you could say, well, he wants to be on earmarks and he's not for earmarks, but that's not necessarily what the grassroots are saying.
I just think there's no coalescing around a non-Romney candidate anytime soon, but we are going to have many further opportunities to talk about it.
I think they need to have a meeting.
I bet they are. Nobody's going to invite me, but if they invite you, will you tell me what happens?
You're not inviting me either. Okay.
Michael Steele, former Republican Party chairman. They may not be inviting you, but I'm so happy that you work here. Thank you for being here.
It's good to be back with you.
It's great to see you again. Happy New Year.
All righty.